Hey everybody, Greg Berninger, Ghent Town historian here, and you guessed it, we're taking another trip into Ghent history, and we have a lot of stops to make. We're visiting all of the sites where churches, places of worship, stand or have stood or almost stood in the town of Ghent. Now, the churches, some have been lost to time, some never came to be, some have changed denominations, and some continue as they always have. And the story of Ghent churches is really a great, maybe the best window into Ghent history. Their chronology follows the pattern of European migration and even migration within the town of Ghent. So we are at our first stop already, the Ghent Reformed Church here in West Ghent. Now, this wasn't the first church in Ghent, but it is the oldest building and longest continuous congregation worshiping in the same place. So this church was founded and built in 1843. Now let's take our mind back to West Ghent in the 1840s. Before this church came to be, the worshiping residents most likely either went north to the Kinderhook Reformed Church, still in existence, or south to Cloverick Reformed, still in a very, very old building, both along the old post road. But the people of West Ghent by 1843 had the finances, the energy, and the faith to build a new church here, making 3 churches over a 13-mile span of the old post road. That's a lot of churches for a fairly small population. But there were mills here in West Ghent, and of course, a tavern. The Van Bramer Tavern was just down the hill past the cemetery. I don't know of any particular tension between taverns in Ghent and churches, but historians have noted there often was tension, especially since taverns were almost always exclusively male places, and churches were about 2/3 female in attendance at the time. Most taverns in the neighborhood predated the churches. Men could go there and get awfully drunk and either stumble safely home or get on their horse, and the horse would have known the way home. And, you know, sometimes women in particular didn't care much for that. Now, in fact, I have found evidence that the relationship between the church here and the Van Bramer Tavern may have been okay, because there were references in newspapers to women holding picnics and fundraisers to build the church near here and referencing the Van Bramer Tavern. So who knows? We can't go back in history and find out. So while I take a trip to our next church location, I'm going to drop in some beautiful old photos here of this church, which has been a center of life here in West Ghent since 1843. And we've come to our second stop on our tour of Ghent church sites. I'm at the intersection of Tallarico and Old Tallarico Road, site of Grimaldi Farms, a great place to buy your local beef. And you may be wondering what I am doing here on a church tour. Well, according to Ellis's History of Columbia County, there was a church building begun very near here in 1774. At the same time, a church was begun 3 miles northeast of here on what is now Cemetery Road. We're going to visit that site. And the race was on to see who could finish their church first and thus become the first Dutch Reformed church in Ghent. And the people here in West Ghent lost, and the project was abandoned. A partially finished church stood near here for years before becoming a safety hazard and being torn down. And now you can imagine, because people always take time to imagine the people in Ghent who were here before you and what they were feeling and thinking right? You can imagine how disappointed the families in this area were, the Kittles, the Phillipses, and others. How disappointed they were when this project had to be abandoned. And then having to look at it for years as the frame that was here slowly decayed. You can almost feel their stomach turning and their eyes averting as they went past the church that was never finished. There has been over the years a little tension between East Ghent and West Ghent, or Ghent and West Ghent, and I think this is probably one of the earliest examples of that. Who is going to have the church in Ghent? Now, of course, 1774, there really was no Ghent, okay? Nobody was using that word. Ghent did not become a town till 1818, so nobody would have said East or West Ghent or West Ghent or Ghent. But we're talking about events that took place in this town prior to it being a town. So let's move on to the very newest of buildings in town that have been used for worship. And we've moved down the road a little bit from Grimaldi Farms to the current site of In Flight, where they empower people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to reach for hopes and dreams and to promote a meaning quality of life. But we're not here to talk about In Flight. We're here to talk about this building that was built around 1980. So as I said, the newest of Ghent's houses of worship. And this was built as a kingdom hall for the Jehovah's Witness. And the Jehovah's Witness are a non-Trinitarian Christian church. For instance, they teach that Jesus is the Son of God, but is not a part of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. But if you want to learn more, you should consult a religious scholar and not the town historian of Ghent. Jehovah's Witness was started in Pittsburgh, but this particular Kingdom Hall, Pittsburgh 1870s, and this particular Kingdom Hall came around 110 years later. As far as I know, the congregation is still doing well. They built a new Kingdom Hall on Route 9 in Greenport. So many of you are familiar with this building because it is located right here on Route 66, just north of where Ostrander Road hits Route 66. So on to one of Ghent's older sites, our first church that is no longer there. And well, you'll find out in a minute where we're headed. All right, folks, we've made our way to German Church Road, and the astute among you, I'm sure, have already figured out that there was a church, a German church on German Church Road. And we have a stunning photo of German Church that I'm going to just drop in right here. Many thanks to one of the best friends of Ghent history, Bill Satter, who lent this great photo to be scanned into the digital archive for the town of Ghent. Isn't that a stunner? And here's a little lesson for people who like to go to the site and look at the old photo. The building always looks much bigger than the foundation looks. Believe me, as someone who looks at a lot of old photos, then goes to the site to see what's there, the foundation looks like it could be a big shed. And of course, the building looks huge in the old photo. And I'm sure the other thing you noticed in that photo, almost a complete absence, or I think total absence of trees. There weren't a lot of trees in the mid-19th century. Many, many more trees now than there have been in Ghent for probably a couple of hundred years. Now, you may remember at the beginning of our time together today, I said how the churches developing in Ghent reflected European migration. 1770s, you have the first church being built, the Dutch Reformed Church, the first Europeans in the Hudson Valley, the Dutch colonizing it. Second wave, Germans. Of course, it's not quite as neat and tidy as this. The Germans, many came up from Germantown. And of course, the second churches you have built in Ghent, the Lutheran churches. This particular church was organized in 1850 from a small German congregation, and Reverend G. Borchert became pastor in 1851. Now, a lot of churches didn't jump right into building a building. You started in people's homes, maybe barns. This church started meeting at the Walter Meyer Schoolhouse, also known as the District 7 Schoolhouse, which still stands at the top of the hill on Route 66 where Solar Heights Road comes out. So that's where they started. And right about that time, the school board had to take a vote. Everybody in District 7 voted to allow other organizations to use the school, and the German church was very glad to do that. However, nothing beats having your own building. So in 1855, they built their own church here, and in 1869, it was enlarged by an additional 18 feet. Through most of the 19th century, German immigration to America increased every year, and the largest ethnic group, people of German heritage, that's the largest ethnic group in America, are people of German descent, including, of course, yours truly. My grandmother was a Walter Meyer, I'm a Berninger, and a lot of German names involved in my past. Many settled in the Midwest, but Ghent certainly welcomed its share. Now, so the German church, we have behind church is the cemetery. And I have a particular connection and interest in this cemetery. In the cemetery is a gravestone for my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, Christian Ludwig Berninger. And he came here, his wife accompanied him, Anna Barthelmy, Anna Berninger. Barthelmy became shortened to Bartel, and of course her brothers, some of her brothers came also, and the Bartels, of course, and Berningers, we're still around Ghent. Now the gravestone is here, but my great-grandparents are not here. There's a memory floating around in my head of Anna getting a little upset with this church and then joining the Dutch Reformed Church. And so actually she and Christian are buried in the Ghent Union Cemetery, where we will be stopping next. So interesting, they have a lovely stone here, but they're not here. So anyway, onward and upward to our next stop. And we've made our way to the intersection of Cemetery Road and Ghent-Melonville Road. Now, I've talked at length in previous videos about this church site, and of course, most people, until the Ghent Town historian had this beautiful Pomeroy Foundation marker placed here, had no idea there was ever a church here. But there are some clues that there were churches here. The Ghent Union Cemetery, which is non-denominational, the Union Cemetery, but across over there is a graveyard. Now, cemetery, graveyard, those words are essentially interchangeable, but in another sense, churches had graveyards near them, small little graveyards, kind of like that one. And a lot of the people buried there were people who lived nearby or in a settled area, because in the 1700s, early 1800s, a lot of families had their own family plots on the family farm. There are small little family cemeteries all over Ghent, some of which the stones are there, some of which the stones removed. We assume the bodies are still there, but they are numerous here, and there are probably many we don't even know about. So anyway, we're at the site. As I said earlier, when we were at the along Talarico and Old Talarico Road, that there was that race in the 1770s, and the people here won the race. And they got a church built, and this became the first functioning church building in the town of Ghent. Even though it wasn't Ghent yet, this at that time was the absolute northern boundary of Cloverick. This was the absolute northern boundary of Cloverick. And the pastor would visit every so often, not even every week, from Cloverick. So in some sense, in the early days, this was a satellite of the Cloverick Reformed Church. And as you know, the sign tells us in 1815 they pitched in with the Lutherans, built a new building, and then the Lutherans moved on to where we're going to head off next. But what happened to this building? Well, it burned 2 days before Christmas in 1868, and that was the end of worship in this frankly marvelous spot. This is one of my favorite places in Ghent, with the cemeteries, with my family, and so many other great Ghent families, and of course the beautiful farmland to the south here, and it's just a great spot. So it's a shame that that church burned down and Now, it is a nice empty spot with a flagpole, so it's still a great place to come and visit. So, onward, just a little to the north. As I said, this is the home of the Ghent Reformed and the Lutherans, separate from the Lutherans on German Church Road. And the Lutherans left here in 1846. They were bought out, their half of the church, and they moved just up a little ways to our next stop. And as promised, we've moved just a little ways from our last stop. In fact, the Lutheran church that stood here, standing on the front porch of this church, they could just look through the fields and they could see the church that they had moved from, where the Dutch Reformed Church was still worshiping. So this congregation was founded June 1st, 1801. And as I said, they shared a building with the DRC for a little bit. And they finally moved to their own building here in 1846. And it was built on the land of Ghent's first town supervisor, Dr. Edward B. Pugsley. Now, you may be wondering if I've lost my mind. There's just a bunch of trees here now. But you know, if you really come by here on Koenig Road and you stop, there's a mailbox here that says 24 on it, and you take a look, you can actually see that there's still a little bit of a gap in the trees. The church stood here until 1920, at which time the building was taken apart and reassembled, looking very similar, and that'll be our next stop, on Main Street in Ghent. And you know, this tells us about migration within the town of Ghent. So we talked a little bit about West Ghent. The main settlement of early Ghent, pre-Ghent, before 1818, was along what is now Route 66, where Snyder and Cemetery, where Broadstairs is. So it made sense that the churches were right here. But when the railroads came, the population center migrated north, and the churches followed. So this church moved to Main Street in Ghent in 1920. And if you go back in there, which I have, I made a video in there about the history of, anybody remember? The Ghent Band. Because in 1898, give or take a year, the Ghent Band, the first few members got together and blew their horns in the basement of the church that was here. Now, just to blow your mind again, I'm going to drop a photo in here of the church that stood here, where all these trees are now, and take a look and you'll see the carriage barns, and you'll see that there's nary a tree in sight. So take a look at this pic while we just head up a little bit further into the hamlet of Ghent. Here we are at the Ghent Lutheran Church, as promised, and this of course is the building that once stood down on Koenig Road. This is now the home of the Hudson Valley Mennonite Church. The Ghent Lutherans have merged with the Lutherans in Chatham, and they're now just over the border in the town of Chatham, in the village of Chatham also. So July 31st, 1921, the cornerstone of this church was laid with great fanfare, and the Ghent Band led the procession, of course, and the same columns greeted the worshipers here as they did on Koenig Road. The sun shone through the same windows, and the fine walnut trim from the 1846 building was fashioned into the pulpit and lectern altar baptismal font and hymn board in this church. And this new building was dedicated September 24, 1922. So they've got a birthday coming up this weekend, I think. And it's a very fine building. And I'll drop a pic in here of when it was looking brand spanking new. And we're going to head on to the new version of the Ghent Reformed Church. Okay, before we, of course, leave the hamlet of Ghent, we need to stop by what is now the Bible Baptist Church here on Church Street, right where Town Hall Place hits it. We're right behind the Ghent Firehouse. As we noted earlier, The first Reformed church burned in 1868, and rather than rebuild down there in what was old or lower Ghent, they chose to come up here where Ghent life had shifted, because this is where the train station was, the hay presses, the Bartlett House. It was the new population center in town. So by 1870, again, this was the heart of Ghent. And by 100 years later, though, the congregation here was starting to dwindle. The congregation in West Ghent was starting to dwindle, and reaching way back to the Battle of the 1770s. Well, in the 1970s, these two churches decided to become one. And on good authority, Dick Leggett, the plan was to build a new church somewhere in between, but the Bible Baptists showed immediate interest in this building, and rather than miss that opportunity, this building was sold, and both congregations moved into the 1843 building where our tour started, and thus became the Ghent Reformed Church in West Ghent. And the two congregations again became one and are still there today. So it is somewhat fitting, of course, that the oldest congregation, the Ghent Reformed, are now in the oldest church still standing in the town of Ghent. This church is where I happen to be baptized. I was probably one of the last baptisms here in September of 1969, and the Berninger family attended this church for many years. And I'm going to drop in a pic here of this building when it was newer, and I'm also going to drop in a pic of my favorite windows, which are still in this building. We're going to jump a little bit outside the hamlet here up to Water Street and talk about one of the newer groups that came to Ghent. So I've been moving through our church sites a little quickly. I know I get very excited when I'm out here talking Ghent history, communing with the past, and communing with all of you. So I just want to take a little intermission here and slow things down just for a bit and talk about how important these churches were and are to the people of Ghent. Particularly, so the obvious, their spiritual life, their belief system around God, for the most part, Jesus here in Ghent. That's, of course, exceedingly important to people. People's social lives also very much, the church has been a center of that, especially early on. So in the late 1700s, people rarely left the family farm, maybe once a week to go to church. So that is an essential place where families would gather and share information, talk about maybe farming practices, maybe gossip a little bit about the neighborhood, which of course gossip is important to keeping people stitched together. Young people, right? So even before schools were established, the churches existed. So young people would meet each other, maybe catch one another's eye and wind up marrying and continuing on that family in Ghent. Additionally, especially at the early sites, the 1700s, early 1800s, maybe even the enslaved in Ghent accompanied the families to church. I've been reading a book about slavery in the Hudson Valley and the Dutch Reformed Church. Many of them did allow slaves in. They often sat in the back or in the balcony, but they were allowed in. And maybe some were not. Maybe some chose not to come in, but they would have accompanied their owners to church and maybe stayed outside. Now this, of course, is interesting because this is also a place where African Americans, the enslaved, could meet with one another, talk about conditions, maybe talk about an escape. Who knows? But the church, since their origin here in Ghent, has been a gathering place for people to get to know one another, to share information, to connect, to do what makes us human, to connect with other people. So I wanted to make that important point out of the context of any church in particular, that they are the oldest institutions in Ghent, and in my view throughout history they are what have stitched the families and the people together. So anyway, let's get back to our travels. So we've made our way to kind of right about where Water Street becomes Harlemville Road, near the intersection of Pock Road and Water Street, not right before you go up the big hill into Scannellville. And we've come here because in the fields here somewhere was the Quaker meeting house. Now there was a steady presence of Quakers in Ghent from the 1790s into the early 1900s. And it's very likely that the original Quakers here in Ghent had moved out from Hudson. And of course from Hudson, we know Hudson was settled by Nantucket whalers and Quakers that had come from, well, Nantucket and eastern Massachusetts. So it's kind of interesting. You have the Dutch, the German, and then very early you have the sort of English coming in through Hudson and spreading out into Ghent here. Now the Quakers were ardently anti-slavery. Now slavery existed here in Ghent until 1827, when slavery was outlawed for the most part in New York State. But the Quakers, there was still tension over slavery, as there was throughout the country, at least in the North, right up until it ended during the Civil War, or after the Civil War. So the Quakers here in Ghent were ardent anti-slavery, and sometimes they got a little upset when the other churches would refuse to take a position, a strong position. This is a letter from Miss Holly, Ghent, New York, June 16th, 1856, written to an abolitionist. The border ruffians are not all in the immediate vicinity of Kansas. Of course, there was a lot of violence in Kansas around the issue of slavery. And she writes about a meeting here in Ghent for our esteemed friend Sally Holly, abolitionist. I had occasion to have an interview with Reverend Nathan Cornell, pastor of the Lutheran Church, and in the course of our conversation I was made to realize more fully than ever that the ministers of that popular religion of this country are among the great hindrances to the cause of freedom. When I had made known to him the object of my call, he at first agreed with me in desiring to arrest the attention of the people to the subject of slavery, but he thought they would object to introducing a political question into the church on the Sabbath. I told him that the abolitionists made it especially moral and religious and not a political question. So really right here in the town of Ghent you have a very interesting, the issue of the day of the 1850s, slavery in America. Again, slavery is out of Ghent in 1827, but the Quakers were ardent abolitionists and they wanted it brought up as a moral issue, and apparently the Lutheran minister here in Ghent saw it in many ways more of a political issue, and he didn't think that politics should be brought directly into his church on Sundays. And Miss Holly here, or actually Elizabeth M. Powell, out of Powell Quakers here in Ghent, was not very happy with the Lutheran Reverend and his seeing slavery not necessarily as a moral, but more of a political issue. So again, you know, even though we have do unto others and the Ten Commandments and Christ, there was always, you know, churches are comprised of people and strong feelings, a lot of passion, and sometimes there may have been a little tension between the congregations here in Ghent. So now we're going to actually jump up into the village of Chatham and finish up our tour with a few stops up there. All right, we're made it here into the village of Chatham. We are at the north entrance of the fairgrounds along Church Street. Another clue, right? That there was a church here. And yes, a look at the old map tells us that in fact the original Catholic church built here in Chatham was right across from the fairgrounds entrance, and there was in fact a cemetery behind it. And like some of the other churches in Ghent, and yes, we are in the town of Ghent, We made a video about that, where Ghent and Chatham begin and end. The Catholic Church started later than the Protestant denominations. The Irish immigrants came, and then Italian immigrants followed after that. But in Chatham here was one of the first Catholic churches in northern Columbia County. I know when I worked at Martin Van Buren's house, we used to say the Irish servants there maybe occasionally made it over here to Chatham for worship. And there's a Catholic church pretty early though in Valatia as well. And so the Catholics worshipped here on Church Street until 1892, when they moved just a couple hundred yards that way and built the St. James Church that is there now. Now there's a clue that the original church members here were Irish because it was St. Patrick's, and of course now it's St. James, a more neutral name between Irish and Catholic observers and churchgoers. So we've got one more stop to make before we wrap up our tour of churches in Ghent. And we're going to actually drop a pic in here before we go. Some nice old postcards of the St. James Church. Looks very much like it does today. You'll notice the colorized postcard, it's gray. Well, the people who colorized those postcards were probably in Germany and had never been to Chatham, and they just picked gray. The church was never gray. So anyway, moving on to our last stop. And here we are at our last stop, visiting Ghent's churches. And we are at the St. Luke's Episcopal Church here across from the middle school in Chatham Public Library. And it's one of the newer congregations. On October 1st, 1883, the Reverend William Coswell Doane, first bishop of the Diocese of Albany, fully organized St. Luke's mission in the Chatham village. And 1884, procedures were begun to start the fund for construction. Took a little while. But on Easter Day, 1893, the church was fully completed and open for divine service. Now, somewhat symbolically, though maybe not historically accurate, I'm going to say this is, one of the newer churches, and the Episcopal Church is like the Church of England, and the English were among the last of the northern European groups to migrate to Ghent. Of course, we have the Dutch, the German, and the English. And of course, the English were here long before. They were here as Quakers, and the English could have integrated, of course, into the Dutch Reformed and the Lutheran churches as well, though we failed to mention the earliest services in the Dutch Reformed Church were very likely conducted in Dutch. So the English would not have been particularly made to feel welcome there. So our last stop, St. Luke's here, the Episcopal Church in Chatham, still going strong here in the village. Now, of course, if I've left anything out on today's tour, I'm sure you'll let me know. Always drop me an email, historian@townofghent.org. And if you want to let me know about anything or ask me any Ghent questions, you can use that email. And if you want to put a request in for future videos, I think I fulfilled the Elephant Farm request, the Ghent Chatham Town Line request, now the church's request. I have one other request in the queue, but let me know what you'd like to hear about. So thanks for coming along today on my trip through the spiritual life, at least the sights of Ghent's spiritual life. And we will, of course, as always, see you around town.